I stood in the far corner of the room long before anyone else arrived, staring at the dull grey carpet like it could steady the shaking under my ribs, and the quiet around me felt wrong, too clean, too controlled, as if the air itself already knew something I had not yet allowed myself to understand, and the fluorescent lights above hummed in a way that made my skin itch, a low, persistent sound that blended with the memory of everything that led me into this place, this moment, this awful hollow of truth that refused to loosen its grip, and I kept telling myself to breathe, telling myself to hold on, telling myself I was strong enough to sit through what was coming, even though every part of me felt like it had been scraped thin and left exposed. And as I waited, I thought of the person who once filled this house with laughter, a warmth that lived in every corner, even the corners that kept secrets, a warmth I clung to for years after the world pulled her away from me too soon. And I remembered the boy she lifted into her arms, a boy who used to tug at my sleeve, begging for attention, for praise, for validation, for reassurance. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the twist of knowing that same boy was now the reason I stood here unable to steady my breath, because children do not always grow into the people we imagine, and love does not always take the shape we hoped it would, and sometimes the ones we raise become the ones who ruin us, not out of evil, not out of hatred, but out of weakness and hunger, and the willingness to let someone else do the thinking for them. And the door opened behind me, breaking my thoughts like glass under a shoe, and I turned slowly, already bracing myself before I even saw who entered. And there he was, the grown version of that boy, with shoulders pulled tight and eyes that would not meet mine, as if he feared what might spill out if he dared to look too closely. And behind him, she walked in like she owned to the room, the confidence rolling off her in cold waves, her smile too sharp, her gaze too calculating, and I felt something in my stomach twist hard, because I knew that look. I had seen it before in the eyes of people who learned early how to take without flinching, people who perfected the art of turning affection into leverage and leverage into power. And as they moved closer, she was the one who spoke first, always the one who spoke first, her voice dripping with ease as she thanked me for coming, thanked me for listening, thanked me for being open to the conversation, even though I had never agreed to anything except showing up. And he stood beside her, nodding in all the wrong places, his hands fidgeting the way they did when he was young and guilty and terrified and lost, and I felt the weight of years settle on my shoulders, heavier than grief, heavier than fear, because suddenly I understood it fully, painfully, completely. He was not leading anything here. He was not steering any of this. He was a passenger in his own life, leaning into her confidence, because he had none of his own left, and she spread the papers on the table between us, slowly, deliberately, as if unwrapping a gift, and I recognized the style, the fonts, the hollow motivational quotes sprinkled between the numbers, all the trademarks of a plan built to impress rather than to work. And she talked and talked and talked, spinning dreams out of thin air while he stood there echoing her words, like a shadow, and I listened, because listening was all I had left. Listening and trying to understand where exactly I had lost him, where the road forked, where the boy who once asked for my help fixing a broken toy had grown into a man who could look me in the eye and lie so easily. And when she finally reached the end of her pitch, she slid the paper toward me, the one with the number on it, the one that made my throat dry, the one that told me everything I needed to know about what they expected. And he watched me with that fragile, desperate look that made my heart ache, even as anger flickered beneath it, because I knew he wanted to believe this would work, that this was his chance, that this woman beside him was the one who would turn his failures into victories and his grief into purpose, and that I was the only obstacle standing between him and the future she promised. And I folded my hands, because if I didn't, they would shake. And I asked him, not her, to explain it to me, to tell me in his own words what he wanted, and for a moment I thought I saw him struggle, thought I saw him searching for something real, something that belonged to him, not to her. But then the moment slipped, and her voice rushed in again, smooth and practiced, drowning out whatever truth might have tried to surface. And I listened to her talk about opportunity and loyalty and supporting family and stepping up when it mattered most. But all I heard underneath it all was the truth. She would not say out loud that she wanted the money, not the dream, not the partnership, not the future, just the money, the access, the control, the easy path, carved through someone else's years of sacrifice and labor. And I looked at my son, really looked and saw the way his eyes flicked. To her before answering, saw the way his shoulders tensed. When she placed a hand on his arm, saw the way his breath hitched when I asked too many questions, and I felt grief coil around my heart because I realized he was not choosing her dream over mine. He didn't even have a dream left to choose. He was choosing the feeling of being wanted, of being important, of being needed, because she fed those parts of him relentlessly until he could not tell the difference between love and manipulation. And my chest tightened as he finally spoke in his own voice, small, hesitant, cracked around the edges, telling me he needed me, telling me he believed this was everything, telling me he couldn't do it without me. And I heard the truth beneath the words he could not do anything without someone pulling the strings for him anymore. And I felt something inside me shift, not break shift, because this was the moment I had feared for years, the moment when I finally saw the distance between who he was and who I hoped he would be, and the distance was too wide, too deep, carved by choices I could not undo and people I could not change. And I told him I needed time, told him I would read everything again, told him I would think, and the disappointment in her eyes was instant, sharp like a blade, and the panic in his eyes cut even deeper because he knew she was disappointed, and her disappointment mattered more to him right now than anything I felt. And as they left the room, she spun back with that thin smile that never reached her eyes and said she hoped I made the right decision because it would determine whether I remained part of his life. And I stood there in the suffocating quiet after the door shut and finally let myself admit the truth. The future was coming and it would break one of us no matter what I chose. I drove home with the stack of papers sitting on the passenger seat like a living thing breathing beside me, each page radiating a pressure that throbbed against my skull, and every mile felt longer than the last, as if the road itself understood I was carrying something that was already tearing at the seams inside me. And by the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had shifted lower, casting long, thin shadows across the yard, shadows that looked too much like fingers reaching for me, gripping me, dragging me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. And when I stepped into the house, the quiet wrapped around me in a suffocating way, not comforting, not familiar, but tight, hostile, like even these walls, which had held my grief for years, were bracing themselves for what would come next. And I set the papers on the kitchen table and stared at them without touching them again and again, willing myself to believe there was something real here, something solid, something that would make all of this make sense. But the memory of her voice, the woman beside him pushing every word forward, with that sugary forcefulness, kept looping in my mind, a tone that always carried more hunger than hope, more possession than partnership. And I felt my hands tremble slightly, not from age, not from fear, exactly, but from the realization forming slowly that I had not just been presented with a business plan, I had been presented with a test wrapped in the language of opportunity, but pulsing underneath with threat and expectation. And as I sat down, I tried to remember the last time my son came to me with something that belonged only to him, something not shaped by someone else's wants. But the hardest part was realizing I couldn't find that memory anymore, not clearly, not in years. And when I opened the first page and forced myself to read with the steady eyes I used to rely on for every important decision in my life, I saw it instantly the same: glossy promises, padded with buzzwords, empty assurances, future that depended entirely on the money they wanted, not on the work they were willing to give. And each page felt thinner, more fragile, more dishonest than the last, and by the time I reached the end, my stomach was tight and hot, like someone had reached inside and twisted it slowly and deliberately. And I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe past the tightness in my throat, trying to understand how we had come to this, how my son had allowed himself to become someone who couldn't see the ground beneath him because he was too busy chasing the version of success that glittered loudest and demanded most. And I thought back to the years after the woman I loved died, how grief hollowed him out, how he wandered through life searching for something that would make him feel anchored again, how he latched onto people who spoke with certainty because he had none left inside himself. And I wondered when exactly he stopped listening to his own voice and started echoing someone else's, as if she had reached into the tooling, empty spaces. Grief left behind, and filled them with her own ambitions until he mistook those ambitions for destiny. And when the phone rang sometime near dusk, I already knew who it was because desperation has a sound, and his voice carried that sound before he even spoke, and he asked if I had read. Everything asked. If I understood the urgency, asked if I was ready to move quickly, like time was running out, like the world would collapse if I didn't act immediately. And I told him I had read everything, told him I had concerns, told him I needed more information, and the moment the word concern left my mouth, I heard her voice in the background, sharp, annoyed, ready to strike, and he faltered, little stuttered as if torn between responding to me and responding to her, and that hesitation cut deeper than any anger he could have thrown at me, because it told me everything. His choices were no longer his, not fully, not freely, and he lowered his voice then, as if trying to hide the fear. Creeping in as if trying to shield himself from her reaction, he began rushing through justifications, explanations, promises, none of which held weight, none of which sounded like convincing arguments because they weren't. They were rehearsed speeches prepared for him, not by him, and I finally said the words that made the air on the phone go tight. I can't give you that amount, not like this, not without clarity, not without something real, and he went quiet completely. Silent long enough that I thought the call had dropped until I heard her voice take over, cold slicing through the space between us, telling me I was being unreasonable, telling me I didn't understand, telling me that true belief required risk and faith and sacrifice, and I listened, letting her words spill out without responding because this wasn't her conversation, this wasn't her place, and yet she had taken control of it so easily, so confidently, as if she had waited for this moment, and I felt something behind my ribs twist again, something older, heavier, angrier, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that mourns quietly for the child who once depended on my guidance instead of someone else's pressure. And when I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue, I simply repeated what I had already said, and the silence that followed, this time was not shock, it was fury, silent, controlled, burning, and then my son's voice returned. But it was different, tight, desperate, trembling with the fear that saying no to her meant losing her, and that fear came through every word as he told me I was abandoning him, told me I was sabotaging his future, told me I didn't believe in him, and each sentence felt like a blade pushed deeper, not because of the accusation, but because I recognized the pattern, the manipulation being fed to him, spoken through him, and I knew the truth. He wasn't angry at me. He was terrified, terrified of failing again, terrified of losing the only person he believed could save him from himself, and terrified that asking me for money had become the only tool he knew how to use to keep his life from unraveling. And when the call ended abruptly with her snatching the phone, away I sat there staring at the darkening window, unable to shake the thought that the boy I raised was slipping further away each time she whispered in his ear, and something cold and steady formed inside me. Then an understanding that no matter how much I loved him, no matter how much I wanted to save him from this path, I could not fight a battle he didn't want to walk away from. I could only protect the pieces of myself I still had left and wait for the truth to catch up to him. And that realization sat heavy in my chest as the night deepened and the house grew darker. And for the first time since losing the woman I loved, I felt the exact moment when heartbreak stops being a feeling and becomes a decision, a quiet, bitter acceptance that nothing I said, nothing I did would reach him until the world he was clinging to finally collapsed under the weight of its own lies. I woke the next morning with a strange ringing in my ears, the kind that comes when the mind has not truly slept, and the weight of the previous night pressed against my lungs before I even swung my feet to the floor. And as I walked through the house, each step felt heavier than the last because the truth had settled into me like cold iron. My son was no longer making choices. He was being steered, pushed, reshaped into something that served someone else's hunger. And every instinct in me wanted to reach for him, pull him back, hold him, steady the way I once did when he was small and frightened. But the years had changed him, and grief had softened parts of him that ambition easily hardened and manipulation easily bound. And when the phone rang again, sharp against the quiet, I already knew the tone waiting for me on the other side, because desperation has its own rhythm. And when I answered, his voice came through, cracked, jittered, pulled thin as if stretched between fear and urgency, and he said he needed to see me face to face. He said this could not wait, said everything depended on it. And though dread sank into me, I agreed, because there was a time when I promised the woman I loved that no matter how hard things became, I would never turn my back on him, and I carried that promise into the car with me as I drove to the cafe. He mentioned a place too polished, too loud, too full of mirrors and steel, a place that matched her more than him. And when I walked in, the first thing I saw was her sitting upright in the booth like a queen, preparing to assign blame her, smile tight and bright and empty, and he sat beside her, hands clasped so hard his knuckles had gone pale, and he looked at me with eyes that begged for a version of this moment that would not break him. But she spoke first, always first, her voice coated in charm that tasted like poison, and she said she hoped I had come to my senses, hoped I realized how foolish hesitation would look in hindsight, hoped I understood that this opportunity would never come again. And I watched him deflate beside her shoulders, curling inward, because her confidence had carved out all the space he might once have used to form his own thoughts. And he tried to speak, tried to explain how important this was to him, but she cut him off, again and again, each time, inserting her narrative, her urgency, her vision, until he simply lowered his eyes, letting her words stand in place of his, and something in my chest tightened with a familiar grief, old and sharp, because this was not partnership, this was possession, and he could not see it through the haze of wanting to be valued, wanting to matter. And when I finally lifted a hand to stop her, the shock on her face was almost comical, as if she genuinely believed she could talk forever without being challenged, and I told her calmly that I would speak to my son alone, and the refusal shot across her face instantly. But the panic in his eyes cut through her bravado, and he touched her arm, gently whispered something I could not hear, and after a long, seething moment she stood, walked out onto the patio, and left him sitting there, trembling like a man unanchored. And he kept his eyes on the table as he spoke, his voice so thin it almost broke apart, mid-sentence, and he told me he needed this, needed something to work, because nothing else, in his life, had held together since she died. Told me he didn't want to keep failing, told me he didn't I know who he was anymore. And the honesty in his voice cut through me like a blade, because this was the truth buried beneath, all the noise he was drowning, and she had offered him land, even if it was only sand that would sink under him. Eventually, and I reached for his hand, but he pulled back quickly, like someone afraid of being seen too clearly, and he begged, in a cracked, exhausted whisper, for the money, begged with the desperation of a man who believed this was his last rope, and every word he said dragged guilt across my chest, until breathing felt impossible, and I told him gently, painfully, that I could not give it, not because I didn't love him, not because I didn't believe he could rebuild, but because this plan would destroy him faster than failure ever had. And the moment the refusal left my mouth, I saw something shift in his eyes, not anger, not yet something colder, something that did not come from him but from the seeds she had planted carefully over months, and he tightened his jaw and said, I clearly did not want him to succeed, clearly wanted him trapped, clearly never believed in him, and I could hear her voice echoing behind each accusation, shaping them, twisting them, feeding him the lines that would cut the deepest, and I tried to speak, tried to remind him of the years, of support, of the countless times I had stood behind him, but he shoved the papers at me, saying none of that mattered if I would not help him now, and before I could reply, she returned, sliding into the booth like a blade, returning to its sheath, ready to strike. And she spoke for him again, weaponizing his vulnerabilities, telling me he was done begging, telling me that if I couldn't support them, then I was choosing to destroy his future, telling me that he did not need a father who held him back. And the words that followed from her mouth were so venomous, so rehearsed, so deliberately cruel that even he flinched, but did not stop her, and she said that if I refused today, I would never see him again, that he was done with people too small to understand ambition, that they would build a life without me. And he stared at me as she spoke, his eyes glassy, desperate, torn between wanting her approval and wanting my love, and I felt my heart crack quietly under the weight of it, because I saw the boy he used to be buried somewhere behind the panic, behind the bravado, behind the lies whispered into his ear, and I realized he was no longer choosing, he was being chosen by the wrong person, chosen by someone who had carved her way into the emptiest parts of him and filled them with her own hunger. And when I stood and told him softly that I loved him, but my answer remained, no. He looked at me like I had struck him, like the world had tilted, and in the moment before she pulled him out of the booth, whispered something I will never forget, something that hollowed me out completely. He said, "You chose your money over me," and then he was gone, dragged toward the door by the woman who wrapped her fingers around his arm like she owned him. As I watched them disappear into the parking lot, something inside me collapsed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet, devastating finality, because I knew in that moment this was no longer about business or dreams. This was about losing my son to someone who had mastered the art of making him believe that love was measured only in dollars and sacrifice. And I stood there long after they left, letting the truth sink in until it settled like cold ash in my chest. The person I once raised, the person I once loved more than my own breath, was slipping into a life where I no longer existed except as a target or an obstacle, and the only thing left to do now was brace for the storm that was coming, because this was only the beginning of the unraveling. I woke the next morning with a pressure behind my eyes like grief, trying to force its way out through bone, and I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what had happened the day before, settle deeper until it was no longer something sitting on my chest but something woven into it. And I knew before my feet touched the floor that he would not let things end at that cafe, that the refusal I gave him would not remain a refusal in his mind. It would become an accusation, a betrayal, a wound he would try to stitch closed with anger and blame, because that was the only thread she taught him to use. And I moved through the house with the heaviness of someone preparing for a storm, not the loud, sudden kind, but the slow, tightening kind that coils around the throat step by step until breathing becomes a decision instead of a reflex. And when the first message arrived, it was exactly as I expected, sharp, cold, written in the cadence of her voice, not his, accusing me of cruelty, accusing me of abandoning him, accusing me of being jealous of his future, jealous of his bravery, jealous of the life he was building without me. And I knew he had not typed most of it, because the vocabulary didn't belong to him, the phrasing didn't belong to him, the tone didn't belong to him, but the wound in it did, the wound she kept pressing every time, whispered in his ear, "You're nothing without me," and I deleted the message without replying, because replying would have been a door, and doors were things she walked through without hesitation, and not an hour passed before the calls began, each one hitting the phone like a stone thrown through a window, and every vibration carried that creeping dread I had learned to recognize over the last year, the dread of knowing his voice wouldn't sound like his own, but something taught, trained, sharpened into a weapon he didn't understand, he was wielding. And eventually the calls stopped, replaced by a long message from him, this time clearly from him because the sentences trembled, the thoughts collided. Anger and fear wove together into something jagged and frantic, and he wrote that I had humiliated him in front of her, that I had made him look weak, that I had made her question their future. And when he said that last part, I felt the sickness roll through me, because it meant she had done exactly what I feared. She had pulled him so deep into her shadow that her approval had become the only oxygen he recognized, and he wrote that if I did not help him now, would lose him forever. And again I felt the twist of knowing those words were not entirely his. They were hers, injected into him like poison, until he believed them, until he spoke them as truth, even though the child he once was would have never spoken to me like that. And that afternoon when I stepped outside to bring in a package, I saw their car turning onto my street fast, too fast, and my whole body tightened because I knew there would be no time to prepare, no time to steady myself, no time to pull the grief back into its cage. And I watched the car pull into the driveway, and she got out first. Always first, with that same hard expression that hid her desperation better than his ever could. And he followed slowly, head down, shoulders tense, trying to swallow the panic that radiated off him in waves. And before I could speak, she launched into accusations, her voice slicing through the air like glass, telling me I wanted him to fail, telling me I never believed in him, telling me I couldn't accept, that he had found someone better to guide him than me. And he stood behind her, nodding like a shadow, mimicking her movements, mimicking her anger, mimicking her certainty, even though his eyes begged for something softer, something real, something that didn't feel like drowning, and I let her talk, let her unravel in front of me until she finally ran out of breath. And when I looked at him directly, she shifted slightly, as if preparing to intercept whatever I said. But he held up a hand in a small shaky plea and asked her to wait. And that small gesture told me there was still a fractured piece of him inside, trying to find its way back to daylight. And he asked me again for the money, this time in a voice stripped of bravado, stripped of logic, stripped of everything except fear. Fear of losing her, fear of losing the identity she had built around him, fear of being alone, fear of failing again. And I felt my throat tighten because love makes the world smaller, sometimes makes the obvious truths harder to see, makes parents try to rebuild their children with their own bare hands, even when the pieces do not fit anymore. And I wanted to grab him, pull him away, hold his face in my hands, and tell him that this was not love, this was not partnership, this was not salvation, but a chain disguised as a hand. But I also knew she had already filled his head with the story she needed him to believe, a story where I was the villain, where she was the savior, where money was the measure of love, and refusal was the measure of betrayal. And when I said the word no again, the world seemed to tilt, and she stepped forward like she had been waiting for that, the moment waiting to strike, waiting to twist the knife. And she screamed that I was pathetic, screamed that I was selfish, screamed that I had never deserved him, screamed that he was ashamed of me, and every word she threw felt like it should have cut me open, but instead, each one slid over me like water, because I realized something in that moment. I was not losing him. Now he had been disappearing for sighting, months fading into her reflection piece by piece, until the boy I raised became unrecognizable even to himself. And when she grabbed his arm to pull him back toward the car, he didn't resist, not because he didn't want to, but because resisting her would mean standing alone, standing unsupported, standing without her voice, telling him who to be, who to blame, who to love. And as they turned away, he looked at me, then just for a breath, one breath, where his eyes cleared for a moment and the grief that lived in them mirrored my own, and he whispered so quietly she couldn't hear, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," and I took one step forward, reaching for him, but she yanked him harder, forced him toward the passenger door, and pushed him inside as if afraid that a single second longer in my presence would undo the hold she had on him. And when the car sped away, the gravel under the tires spraying like broken teeth, I stood in the empty driveway with the knowledge settling into my chest that the next time I saw him, he would not be asking, he would be demanding. And the next time she spoke, it would not be with anger, it would be with destruction, because people like her do not lose quietly. And I walked back inside the house knowing the storm was no longer coming. It had already begun, and the only way to survive it was to hold my ground, even if it meant losing him, even if it meant shattering the last pieces of the life we once shared, because sometimes love is not enough to save someone. Sometimes the only thing left is the truth and the hope that one day they will find their way back to it. The days that followed felt like moving through a house where every room held a different kind of silence, one heavy, one sharp, one aching. And each time I crossed a doorway, it felt like stepping into a memory of what life used to be before, everything twisted into something unrecognizable, and I kept telling myself I was prepared for whatever would happen next, because I had already endured the worst moment. A parent can face the moment they see the person they raised look at them with accusation instead of love. But the truth was, preparation meant nothing when the past still lived in the walls and whispered to you every time you closed your eyes. And I tried to keep busy, tried to clean, to repair, to sort through closets filled with decades of love. But every task felt like holding my breath, underwater, waiting for the surface that never came. And on the third day after the confrontation, the house phone began ringing again. Not the cell, the house phone, the number only 2 people in the world ever used, the number I kept out of habit, out of tenderness, out of mourning, because once it had been the only link between me and the woman who steadied my life. And I stared at the ringing for a moment before answering, and when I did, the sound that came through the line nearly buckled my knees, because it was him, but not the frantic, angry version of him, not the shadow molded by her voice. It was him, the boy, whose voice cracked when he was scared, the young man whose words stumbled when he was ashamed. And he said my name in a way that carried a tremor, like the thin edge of something breaking, and he asked if he could come over, not with urgency, not with manipulation, but with a kind of quiet devastation that told me the world he had clung to was crumbling, and still some part of me hesitated, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I feared what shape he would arrive in, feared how much damage she had done, feared how much of himself he had lost. And I said yes, still knowing the risk, and I waited in the kitchen, staring at the door with a dread that pulsed through me like a second heartbeat. And when he finally arrived, he looked like someone who had been emptied from the inside. Out, his clothes wrinkled, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red. Not from anger this time, but from exhaustion, and he stepped inside without speaking, collapsing into the nearest chair like his legs had finally given up on pretending to hold him upright. And I sat across from him waiting, letting the silence settle until he could breathe again, and after a long, shaky moment, he whispered that she was gone. Just left, packed her things while he slept, walked out the door, without a note, without an explanation, without a backward glance. And he stared at the wall as he spoke, like he wasn't telling me, but telling himself, hoping the story would make sense if he said it enough times. But the truth was, she had never intended to stay. She had come for what she wanted, and when she realized she couldn't get it, she moved on to find someone else, someone with more money, someone easier to control, someone who didn't ask questions. And he told me how she had screamed at him in the final days, blamed him for everything, blamed him for my refusal, blamed him for not pushing harder, blamed him for not being enough, and he sank deeper into the chair, with each word like the shame weighed more than his own body, and I could see it. Then the cracks running through him, the places she had carved with insults and manipulation, the empty spaces where confidence used to live. And he said he was sorry, not the forced apology of a man cornered, not the defensive apology of someone trying to make a deal, but the real kind, the kind that bleeds out slowly from a wound that finally reached the surface. And he told me he had believed her when she said, I didn't want him to succeed, believed her when she said, I loved my money more than him, believed her when she said, I thought he was a failure, believed her until she was the only truth he recognized. And I felt grief pulse through me, because none of this came from hatred. It came from weakness, from longing, from the desperate desire to feel chosen by someone, anyone, even if that someone used him like a tool and threw him away when he no longer served her purpose. And he asked me how he could have been so blind, how he could have hurt me so deeply, how he could have let her shape him into something he didn't recognize. And I wanted to tell him I didn't know, but the truth was I did. Grief is a hunger, and she fed him until he mistook the feeding for love. And I told him gently that healing from this would not be easy, that forgiveness was not a switch to be flipped, that trust would need to be rebuilt slowly. That damage of this scale took time, patience, humility, and work. And he nodded with tears gathering at the edges of his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me like I hung the moon. And he reached for my hand, hesitantly, as if he was afraid he no longer had the right to touch me. And when I didn't pull away, he let out a breath that sounded like a man exhaling years of fear, and we sat there in that small kitchen that had held so much life, so much laughter, so much grief, and now held something else, something fragile and trembling but real, the first fragile thread of reconnection. And he told me he had nothing left. She drained him emotionally, financially, mentally, until he was hollow, and now all he had was the wreckage, and me. His voice cracked on that last word, like he didn't believe he deserved even that. And I told him he wasn't alone, not anymore, but I also told him the truth, that I could not rebuild his life for him this time, that he would have to learn how to stand without leaning on illusions, that he would have to learn to be a man, not a reflection of someone else's desire. And he nodded slowly, like the weight of that truth settled into him piece by piece. And when he finally left that afternoon, he hugged me with the kind of desperation that felt like someone clinging to a life raft. And I held him, not because everything was healed, not because all was forgiven, but because sometimes the first step toward becoming whole again begins with remembering you are still loved. And that evening, after the door closed and the house sank back into quiet, I stood there alone, feeling the ache of everything that had been lost, but also the faint, steady glow of something returning, not the past, not the boy he once was, but the possibility that what remained between us could still become something true, and I realized then that this was not the end of the story. Not for him, not for me. This was the beginning of whatever came next, and I let myself hope for the first time in months that next might finally mean peace. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, quiet rhythm, neither peaceful nor painful, just steady like a tide coming in slower than expected, and I found myself adjusting to this new version of life where he no longer lurched between frenzy and silence, where every day did not carry the threat of another explosion, another demand, another wound carved open, and instead the mornings were soft, the calls gentle, short, hesitant. The way a man speaks when he is unsure, he still deserves an answer, and I let those calls come not with enthusiasm, not with expectation, but with the patience of someone who has seen a storm exhaust itself and drift away, leaving behind a landscape that is damaged but capable of regrowth. And slowly he began to show signs of someone rising, not quickly, not cleanly, but rising all the imso. Same, he found small work, first humble work, the kind that forces a person to rebuild from the ground up, where pride doesn't fit, where ego dissolves, where every dollar earned feels both foreign and sacred. And he told me about his days in clipped, careful sentences, as if afraid of saying too much, afraid of revealing the fragility of the life he was trying to form from ashes. And I listened without judgment, because judgment had no place anymore, not after everything that had happened, not after watching him break open completely. And in those early conversations he apologized again, not with long speeches, not with theatrics, just short, trembling acknowledgements of harm, of selfishness, of blindness. And each apology landed differently than the last, because each one sounded less like guilt and more like truth. And slowly, the bitterness that had once curled around my ribs began to loosen, not gone, not erased, but softened into something bearable, something human, something that could eventually be placed down. And one afternoon he came to visit, driving a car so old it coughed when he parked it, and he stepped out, wearing clothes that didn't fit the sharp, curated image she had crafted for him. And for the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the boy buried inside him, the boy who once ran barefoot through the yard, covered in dirt and joy, without shame or hunger. And he walked up the driveway with a small, uncertain smile, as if unsure whether it was allowed to stay on his face. And we sat on the porch, not talking for long stretches, letting the silence fill the spaces where pain used to sit. And as the sky shifted through color, finally told me everything, every manipulation, every insult, the moment she chipped away at him until nothing remained but obedience and desperation. And I listened, hearing the breaks in his voice, the small tremors in his breath, the shame woven into every memory. And I realized something I had not allowed myself to see clearly before. He had not loved her. Not truly. He had loved the version of himself he believed she created, the confident man she pretended to see. In him, the man he wanted so desperately to become that he let her carve out every part of him that did not fit her vision. And when she left, she did not just take her presence, she took the identity he thought he had built, and he was, standing now in the ruins of that illusion, trying to understand who he was without her script, without her voice, without her demands, shaping his every step. And for the first time since losing the woman who steadied our lives, I felt a small pulse of something like gratitude, because even though the collapse had nearly destroyed him, it was also the only thing that could free him. Nothing else would have broken the hold she had. Nothing else would have forced him to confront the truth. And he sat there on the porch, staring at his hands, and whispered that he didn't know how to be someone good, someone worth trusting, someone worth staying for. And I felt a pain so deep it almost pushed tears into my eyes, because I had waited years to hear him speak with that kind of honest vulnerability, the kind that doesn't hide behind anger or ego, the kind that reveals the soft, terrified center of a person who has finally run out of lies. And I told him gently that goodness isn't built in grand gestures or perfect choices. It's built in the small daily act of trying to grow, trying to stay aware, trying to choose truth even when the truth hurts. And he nodded like he had been waiting for those words for far too long. And over the next months, he began to show up more often, still cautious, still deliberate, but present in a way he had not been in years, helping with repairs, offering his time instead of taking, asking instead of demanding, listening without flinching. When I spoke truths he once would have twisted into weapons, and little by little the house that had once carried only grief began to feel alive again. Not with noise, not with celebration, but with the quiet resilience of a bond, slowly being rewoven. And then came the morning that marked the true turning point, a morning washed in pale sun when he stood in my doorway holding a small battered notebook, and inside were pages torn from the remains of the life he once tried to build with her, pages filled with numbers, ideas, goals, fears, apologies, and he handed it to me. With both hands, like someone handing over something fragile, something sacred, and he said he didn't want money, didn't want investment, didn't want anything except help in becoming someone she could no longer access, someone she could no longer shape, someone he could finally recognize in the mirror again. And I opened the notebook slowly, feeling the weight of this moment, this quiet offering, this first real step toward rebuilding something between us. And I told him I would help, not with money, not with saving, not with fixing, but with guidance, with honesty, with the same steady presence I had always tried to give him, even when he pushed me away. And he nodded with a seriousness I had not seen since he was a teenager, trying to impress his mother with promises of who he, spiting, would grow up to be. And in that moment I realized something. Humbling and profound redemption does not come from punishment, it comes from recognition, and he was finally recognizing himself, the broken parts, the responsible parts, the parts shaped by grief, the parts shaped by her, the parts shaped by me. And as he left that afternoon, he hugged me again, this time not with desperation, but with intention. A silent promise held between two people who had walked through something so dark it almost consumed them, and I stood on the porch watching him drive away in that coughing old car, feeling the tide shift inside me, not back to the past, not toward denial, but toward a future where forgiveness could exist, without forgetting, and where love no longer required self-destruction to survive. And as the sun lowered over the quiet town, I felt the presence of the woman we both loved settle softly around me like a warm, steady hand on my shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe she would be proud of the man he was trying to become and of the man I had fought to remain. And in that breath of calm, after years of chaos, I finally understood that healing is not the absence of pain, it is the courage to let something new grow in the space where pain once lived.